All right. Hafaday Amzu Todos. Este un otro episode Fanachu. This is a new episode of Fanachu. Guåhan Mizutalo. Si Michael Guåhan Bavakwa. I do want to apologize today, though. Our guest that was scheduled for today, he texted to inform that because of an unforeseen emergency, he's currently off island. And because of an unforeseen problem, he hasn't been able to return, and so he's not able to join for today's episode. But Ed Alvarez, former executive director of the Commission on Decolonization for Guam, he will be back. We'll schedule him for a future episode. But we're gonna keep talking about some of the issues, though, that he was going to share and address for today. And so, I'm going to talk about the United Nations, Guam, Solidairty, and get into some of that history. And so to begin with, though, I do want to share something. I'm going to share a documentary that was made by the founder, the godfather of Fanachu, who's currently Dr. Manny Cruz, teaches at the University of Guam. When he was still a grad student, he started the Fanachu podcast. And so he made the documentary that you are about to watch called Decolonize. And he made it to commemorate the trip that you can see right behind me in my digital background. And so before we get into anything, though, let's check that out. Let's check that out. So, Nangon Ratu.
I feel like it's really just more important to try to represent our people in a way that is moving enough to capture the imaginations of the people who are listening. I think a lot of the problem is that a lot of people don't really know what's going on here, and that's why I think it's important that we're sending people that are, that are on the front lines, people that are really familiar with what's going on here. And I think that that's really that's our purpose, is to be able to share stories and share experiences and perspectives that humanize the issue in a way that makes people empathetic to our struggle. So it's really where I'm at. I hope to capture the hearts and minds of the people who are listening, and hopefully something good will come out of it.
How well prepared are you?
Right.
That was one of the things that we brought up yesterday when we were testifying, is just that a lot of the discussion around climate change and rising waters, Guam doesn't get to participate in it because we are an extension of the United States.
Right.
So where all of these islands, Tuvalu and the Marshalls and so on, are going out there and basically trying to shame the world's largest polluters into cutting their emissions so they don't, destroy countries in the Pacific. Guam is represented there by Rex Tillerson or John Kerry before that. And so it's kind of like, yeah, we're part of it. We're connected to all of that, but politically, we can't participate in all of those deliberations or discussions, because whoever at the State Department represents the United States, and therefore they represent Guam. And so all of these other islanders are organizing and trying to build alliances, and then Guam, we can't really do that because we don't get to participate in those forums.
And that's the frustrating thing, is that it's really all directly related to our political status, because we don't do any type of negotiation with any other countries at all. We have zero negotiation. The United States does all the negotiating with other countries, and so even economically, we're in a really great place to take advantage of the Asian market, but we don't take advantage of the Asian market. You know what I mean? Because we don't have that political power to be able to negotiate with other countries. And when countries do negotiate with anything dealing with Guam, the negotiations happen through the United States. And so,
this is Independent Guåhan's segment Chamorro on the Street. It's Chamorro Gitzalan. And so we have randomly found about 15 or so Chamorros in the city of New York There must be some fiesta going on, perhaps a lasodzu. We're not sure. But we are honored to be in the presence of Dr. Tiara Rose Naputi, and so who is a professor of communication at one of the highest states in the United States, in Colorado. And so, from a communications standpoint, Dr. Naputi, what is the importance of coming to the United Nations and telling our stories?
Well, I think thank you for that question. I think the main thing that's really important for people to understand is that communication is one of the primary ways to give voice to our issues and our stories. And that's extremely important because we usually don't have very many folks representing our issues, even though they impact so many of us. The United Nations in particular is a forum that does provide some particular kinds of spaces for us to give our testimonies and to petition to some of the administering powers of the world that maintain the 17 non-self-governing territories. So it's also very important for that very reason to give voice, but give voice in this particular kind of forum that has the promise and the possibilities of decolonizing the world's remaining territories.
So we'll just hold it now, and then you can all put your energy. Oh wait, back row, sorry. Today, Tata Guåhan, Guahu Si Victoria, Lola Leon Guerrero, Gaigiham Gi United Nations. Today we are at the United Nations. We're going to all testify before the Special Political and Decolonization Committee. And we're also bringing the flag of Guam to tell the UN that we're ready for it to hang right behind us, where it belongs with all the other nations of the world.
As a child of the Tautolati from the sands of Chief Matapeng and Chief Hurao, I submit the following recommendations: that the UN sends a mission to Guam and uses its influence to ensure cooperation by the US for genuine decolonization, that the UN condemns the destructive activities proposed by the administering power on the natural, cultural, and archaeological resources throughout the Mariana Islands.
The U.S. Department of Defense is both the nation and the world's worst polluter. There are 95 toxic sites on Guåhan's military bases. This deplorable situation is in blatant violation of Resolution 57/140 that calls to terminate such activities and to eliminate the remaining military bases. However, the administering power has been engaged in massive military buildup and hyper-militarization of our lands. There is no respect for the environment, as the U.S. plans to destroy over 1,000 acres of limestone forest, a distinctive and irreplaceable formation. These military plans will also contaminate our island's largest source of drinking water for their security interests, and again, all without our consent.
We do not begrudge anyone who has come to Guam seeking a new life, but the government of the administering power has recently come to use the diversity of the island as a means of depriving the Chamorro people of their basic human rights. In the past year, federal courts and agencies have begun to try to erase the rights of Chamorros in their own land.
War is a memory over our island. It is acted out when the administering power conducts training and testing, words which mean they are using explosives in our ocean, building firing ranges over the lands where our ancestors raised villages.
In order to colonize the land, one must colonize the minds of the people. The miseducation of our people has worked to marginalize our language, beliefs, history, and practices in spaces of learning to near invisibility.
More of Guam's ancestral lands have been taken from the indigenous Chamorro people to be used for firing ranges, detonation testing, and training.
Sacred lands have been taken, not given, and transformed into unrecognizable premises of development that are alien to our land.
The people of Guam only need the opportunity to close the distance between our past and future to flourish.
United States militarization and occupation has removed Chamorros from spiritually connecting to their history and being forced to relocate to other regions due to economic situations and lack of resources.
Secure land rights for indigenous peoples is a proven climate change solution, and denying indigenous land rights and self-determination is a threat to the world's remaining forests and biodiversity and a primary cause of poverty.
Because when you are caught in the middle of nuclear threats, it doesn't matter who is bluffing, so prove to us that coming here was not a waste of breath. Better yet, come to Guam and smell the stench of death. Yes, my friends, we are dying. In wars that are not ours, that earn us stripes but no stars, we are dying behind bars and in the backs of cop cars. We are dying of cancer and nuclear radiation. We are dying.
4 generations of our people have come before the United Nations pleading for your intervention. So as you hear the dismal realities of our island home, we ask that you do something different. We ask that you focus on the specific actions that can be taken by the United Nations and this esteemed committee to bring about change and resolution to the question of Guam.
We come seeking peace in our homeland, not as a lofty idea, but as a genuine plea that carries as much urgency today as was necessary when the United Nations was chartered in 1945. This powerful gathering of global unity that you are made a promise to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. Please keep your promise to the people of Guåhan.
Pre-World War II, we were like almost 90% self-sufficient, and then after World War II, now we're like importing 90% of our food. And so, you know, our people suffer from the highest rates of non-communicable diseases, you know, incarceration, poverty, drug addiction, violence. So,
well, I think your ally is Puerto Rico.
Right.
An alliance between the different islands, at least countries, that have your status. That's this quite different. Mm-hmm. And I think if I'm you, I'm saying, you know, we've got the same sorts of problems, and let's prevent them rather than finish up with them.
Ooh, Biba. Biba. And so, Sidus Masi, Tatlo, that was Decolonize from Dr. Manny Cruz. And that was a film that he made about this sort of historic visit of Chamorros to the United Nations, people from Guam to the United Nations, the largest delegation of its type. And so in today's episode of Fanachu, we're going to get into that history about how Guam gets connected to the United Nations, why delegations travel there regularly, what is that history? And also, we're going to talk about why it is that some people don't care about this, or some people are very resistant, in fact, very aggressively resistant to the idea of the United Nations in Guam. And so, but yes, this is what we're going to talk about today. And so, first off, let's talk about decolonization in general. And so, after World War II in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, this is considered to be a time of the age of decolonization. And it's interesting because recently the Queen Elizabeth II passed away, and one of the biggest legacies of the British Empire in the 20th century is that dozens of their colonies become independent during this time. And this happens through negotiation, through inertia, sometimes through direct resistance, fighting for independence. But we can see here on the left, this is Tanzania sort of becoming independent. On the right, we have Algeria, independence movements there. And so this is a time when the old sort of empires are starting to fall apart for different reasons. Some of it is because of the maintenance of these empires, changes in international attitudes. Some of it is from people rising up and insisting that they deserve the chance for self-determination and they deserve the chance for freedom and decolonization. So the world is filled during this era with talk of decolonization. In fact, the United Nations, one of its most successful things that it has overseen, because we have to be careful because the UN didn't decolonize these places, but the UN oversaw, sort of was there to witness, to support, to help in different ways, sometimes not particularly helpful, sometimes very helpful, sort of assist hundreds of millions of people who had lived in territories to become independent. And so colonies or territories, per the United Nations, are referred to as non-self-governing territories, right? Because the problem with a territory is that it lacks genuine self-governance. That when you think about sort of your average country today, you know, they can't control everything, but genuine self-governance means that at least internally and to some extent externally, they have the ability to control things like their borders, they can change their economy, they can rewrite or write their constitutions, right? They can outline citizenship, all sorts of stuff like that, right? These are basic things that a territory, that a country can do in order to govern themselves. A territory is considered to be something, a remnant of the old colonial world that has not yet achieved a level of self-governance that is genuine, right? So people say, oh, we're not a colony. Look at Guam. We're not a colony, right? No one is killing us in the streets. No one is trying to steal our gold, stuff like that. That's not what a colony is defined by in the 20th and 21st centuries. It's defined by, is there a lack of genuine self-governance? Can the people there, is there enough self-governance that they can address their basic needs? Are they connected to something larger in which they are full and equal and participate at a level of others, right? So that's why when we think about genuine self-governance, we're not just talking about independence, we also mean that you can be genuinely self-governed within a country, right? You can be a full state or a prefecture or a province or something like that. But as long as you are included along with others and you're not excluded or disenfranchised or marginalized in ways that others are not. So this is key, non-self-governing territories. And dozens of these have moved on to become independent countries, some of them freely associated countries. Very few of them became integrated into their colonizer though. And per the United Nations Charter, countries that have colonies, that have non-self-governing territories are called administering powers. They administer the territories, but because the global order of today allegedly is not supposed to believe in or accept colonies, right? Because of that, if you have territories, it just means that they have not been decolonized yet, which means if you hold on, if you have them, you are obligated to be protecting them, promoting their economics, or promoting their economic betterment, their educational and political development, and all sorts of stuff like that. So there is a sacred trust between those who have colonies, those who are in the colonies, that those who control their destiny still, until the point where they have finally had their self-determination exercised and they have been decolonized, those administering powers, whether they're the United States, the United Kingdom, France, those are the three main ones, they have a sacred trust to take care of and provide for the people in their territories. So that's why it's funny, because when you hear people say, oh, thanks for the federal funds because of the pandemic, it always strikes me as really weird. The United States is internationally obligated to provide for us until the point at which we are either fully a part of them or we are freely associated or independent from them. It is the United States' obligation. And so what does that say about ourselves if we demean ourselves to not expect to be treated with respect, not expect to be treated well by our administering power? There used to be dozens. There are 17 non-self-governing territories left in the world. And these are, here's a list right here. Next to them is the date at which they were added on to the list of non-self-governing territories. And you can see that right after World War II, when the United Nations was established, that was when lots of colonies were placed on the list. And as each decade passes, more and more are taken off the list for various reasons, usually because they become independent. Some of them are taken off the list under very suspicious reasons or not particularly legitimate reasons. Ask the Puerto Ricans about that, who believe in decolonization. You may want to ask them about that. And so these are the non-self-governing territories. And because of their being on that list, the United States is obligated every year to provide a report to the people, to the United Nations, about what is happening in the territories. If you go into the Micronesian Area Research Center, you can see the reports that were submitted in the 1940s and 1950s. This is former UOG president, author, historian, Pedro Sanchez, Dr. Pedro Sanchez. He testified at the United Nations about the non-self-governing territories. And he, interestingly enough, was from Guam, but he testified about what the United States was doing in Micronesia, the trust territory of the Pacific, which was also part of the list of non-self-governing territories, although in a different area because it was part of a trusteeship. And so every year the United Nations asks these questions. Whoever has territories has to respond to them. And then other countries get the chance to also ask questions about these non-self-governing territories. Now, we talked about how decolonization was this thing that people were talking about around the world and people were fighting for. And one thing that always bugs me about Guam history, the way that it's traditionally written, is that it's written sort of in a way in which Chamorros are just these kind of blobs of Latidza or blobs of Kalamai, and history happens around them and they're just kind of there, right? They're not. So this was something that I've complained about before. Historians who write about the Spanish era, the late Spanish period of Guam history, they write about Guam, all these revolutionaries and political reformers from across the Spanish Empire being sent to Guam and interacting with Chamorros while they are exiled to Guam. But they didn't impact the Chamorros at all or affect their thinking or have any influence on them. It's ridiculous. And finally now, more historians are doing better work to sort of talk about what are the connections. How did having people who are fighting for independence in the Philippines or who are fighting for reforms in Spain itself, them being on Guam, how did it impact the thinking of Chamorros about themselves and their own status politically? And so the same thing happens in the 60s. Sort of leaders on Guam know that Micronesia is engaging the United States, talking about their political future, but Chamorros and people on Guam aren't part of those discussions. They're not part of them in any way, shape, or form. And so the first constitutional convention really is a test of, are we really self-governing in Guam? Do we really have these rights like the United States says we do? How much freedom, how much self-governance do we have? Do we have the ability to really determine things in our own island? And the Constitutional Convention meets, and ultimately they determine that they don't. This is one of my favorite pictures from that. My uncle David Flores, who was the executive director for it, Frank Guåhan, great writer, one of the early writers on political status, Tony Palomo, who I now work in the building where that bears his name, great historian. This is Joe Ada, who's caught in a sleepy moment here with his eyes closed. And this is Adrian Sanchez Dono. And so they ultimately have this convention, but then they realize at the end of it that they don't even have the right as a territory of the United States to write their own constitution. And so the answer really comes to be that they aren't self-governing. They don't have the ability to determine things in their own land. And so you might ask then, well, while they're having these conversations in the local government, what is the mood of people on Guam about the United Nations? What do they think or feel about the United Nations? And so this is from the Pacific Daily News in 1971. And this editorial is titled, you can see it right there, "Go Away, United Nations." So the UN was frequently visiting Guam, but usually in transit. to visit other islands in Micronesia that were where the US was talking about the future of those islands. They were in trust, held in trust by the US. And so they would pass through Guam, but they wouldn't investigate Guam. Guam was on the list of non-self-governing territories, but they wouldn't collect data or talk to people on Guam about what's happening there. And so Guam was kind of isolated from that. Even though the UN was coming through regularly, Guam was not really connected to that. And what we see is actually a lot of the initial interactions with the UN from Guam are quite antagonistic. And so this editorial talks about a letter from then non-voting delegate, actually, excuse me, he was not non-voting delegate yet. He was the Washington representative at that time. Guam wasn't allowed to have a non-voting delegate yet by 71. And so Tony Wampat, he sort of wrote an angry letter telling the United Nations that you have no business talking about Guam. You have no right to talk about Guam. We love America. And we would never do anything to decrease America's influence in our lives. And so this is very much, and then sort of the Pacific Daily News editorial backs that up. And so, and the problem was this came about because I told you every year the United Nations would get reports about what was happening on Guam, and sometimes they would talk about what's happening in Guam. This is why in the 60s, and in the 70s, you actually have in the United Nations, Guam coming up and countries from around the world expressing concern that the United States was militarily or militarizing Guam, increasing its presence on Guam, when the island and the people there still hadn't exercised their right to self-determination. And that that you were allowing people to come in from the States and other countries. And that was also a way that you could possibly dilute the ability of the native people to express themselves and what they want for the future, because you allow so many people. So in the 60s, there was already talk in the UN sometimes about what is the United States doing in Guam. And there's UN resolutions to this point that say that if you have territories, non-self-governing territories, don't have open immigration policies in them and don't militarize them, because this can have a very negative impact on the indigenous people, the native people. And so Wampat and the PDN are responding to the UN talking about Guam, and they don't like it. Both of them sort of accept that America owns Guam. That's what Guam is. It is where America's day begins. It is the tip of America's spear. And they don't like this talk that takes Guam out of that American context, puts it in an international context. And we still have some of that up until today, but these are some of the first reactions to the UN talking about Guam. But as I said, the United Nations was a common thing elsewhere in Micronesia. These are UN delegations that are visiting different Micronesian islands, and they're meeting with people, they're asking questions, they're doing educational campaigns, they've got development programs. So elsewhere, everyone knew the United Nations in Micronesia. In fact, in 1978, because this is when there's still negotiations between the Trust Territory and the United States about what the future is for each of the newly formed or unyet formed island nations around us. And so see, in 1978, you see these are UN representatives that have stopped in Guam to talk to Micronesian students from outside of Guam. So students that come from Chuuk, for example, and other Micronesian countries, to answer their questions about what happens next for their islands and what is the UN's role in this and so on. So what's amazing is that the United Nations is all around us, and it's even coming to Guam, but there's still this strong resistance to the United Nations, because there is this feeling that Guam belongs to America. Our context is defined by what America has done for us and what America wants for us. And people have trouble seeing and imagining things outside of that. And so so with all of this decolonization talk around the world, with leaders on Guam in the late 60s and early 70s, finally talking for the first times, although it is very tentative, about political status change. In the early 70s, the first political status commission was developed. The Guam legislature puts out a number of studies on the issue. If you have access to the Pacific Daily News at that time, Senator Frank Guåhan has a number of really wonderful articles about political status. They represent some of the first times that you had a leader engaging and trying to educate the people about these things, talking about, well, what would Guam be if we were independent? How could we become free associated? What would it mean if we were a state? What is Commonwealth, right? All of these things being unpacked. The United States is in an interesting sort of position because the world is changing. Guam remains kind of the same. By 74, people on Guam can elect a non-voting delegate. By 70, they can elect their governor. But there's this feeling that Guam might want and expect more than that. There's these worries in different parts of the federal government that Guam could ask for more than America was willing to give. There's even some parts of the federal government that were worried that Guam might actually seek, in a very much Cold War mentality, seek to be under another country, seek help from another country because the United States wasn't giving Guam a very good deal. And so these types of conversations are interesting because they're definitely at odds with how most people in Guam felt, but it's the Cold War, and the US has lost the Vietnam War. There's sort of the CNMI is negotiating their future. They want to become a Commonwealth. This is also when you have within the federal government a report now called the Secret Guam Study, which basically suggests that Guam be made a Commonwealth, either exactly like the CNMI or similar to it, in order to maintain control over Guam. And so in the midst of all of this, the US Congress enables Guam and the Virgin Islands to formally draft constitutions. Now, it'll be subject still to federal approval, but the constitutions are drafted. You can see here in this picture, this is then Governor Ricky Berdallo, the president of the Constitutional Convention, the second convention, Carl Gutierrez, and then non-voting delegate Tony Wampat presenting the draft constitution to President then Jimmy Carter. And so what's interesting about this is that the United States had kind of kept the UN away from Guam directly. The UN passed through Guam, but they never visited Guam directly. All of that changes. Once the United States has enabled Guam to draft a constitution, once in 1979, it is announced that there will be a vote on that constitution, the US breaks with its policies and decides to invite and allow a UN delegation to come and visit Guam, a visiting mission. Their purpose is to come and to witness the vote on the Constitution. This was a huge shift. The United States, up until this day, tends not to engage on these things because they feel Guam is theirs. They shouldn't have to answer to anybody. And that's why it's so unfortunate when we do America's diplomatic dirty work for it and we argue that America should be able to do whatever they want with Guam by resisting talk about the United Nations. It's always really unfortunate. But so invited to come to Guam to witness this, the goal being that Guam will pass this draft constitution. The UN and its visiting mission was there to witness it. And then once the constitution is in place, the United States can then ask to have Guam removed from the list of non-self-governing territories, which means the UN, the international community then doesn't have the right to interfere with how the US treats Guam. So note, no real change in political status, but similar to what happened with Puerto Rico, is that once Puerto Rico had a constitution and sort of a fake change in status, the US got Puerto Rico off the list of non-self-governing territories. And so This visiting mission, 3 countries were a part of it, and they came to Guam, they talked to the local community, they talked to the Chamber of Commerce, they talked to senators, they also talked to the activists. And so this is from Robert Underwood's wonderful article from Micronesian Educator in 2015, Jess Mitt, which is sort of his memoirs about sort of the history of self-determination and decolonization activism. And sort of the UN delegation was led by the ambassador of Sierra Leone. And he met with, at that time, Parapada was 2 groups that had come together to oppose the constitution, the draft constitution. And so one thing that he says here is that the delegation gave Tony Leon Guerrero, that's Tony Leon Guerrero, Bank of Guam Leon Guerrero, he has passed away. They nicknamed him Simba because of his fierceness and his passion for his people and for the island, but also because of his beard. They called him Simba, which is the Swahili word for lion. Underwood, they called him Muamba for rock, because it was his role to articulate the ideas of the group, their positions, and so on. And so by this time in 79, Chamorro activist as we know it today, right? I'm a Chamorro activist. Your cousin is a Chamorro activist, right? Sometimes it's even kind of cool to be a Chamorro activist, at least for some people. But at this time, there's not a lot of Chamorro activists. There had been some protests, right? In some ways, but in 79, when this happens, this connects the sort of the still developing and still emerging critical sense of Chamorro consciousness, the activist community that's still like emerging. It connects them though to the United Nations for the first time very directly. Now, this is not the first connection, right? Not at all, because, there's some sort of indirect ephemeral connections. I have a copy of a letter that Chamorro wrote a few years before this to the United Nations asking about these issues. And but this connection between the visiting delegation and the activists on Guam was crucial, because it opened up a new venue in which Guam could speak, and it could speak in a much broader way than ever before, right? Because on Guam, our voices are not heard in the US government. The president is not our president, right? The Senate, the Congress, they're not really our bodies. We have one single non-voting delegate there, right? Even when you look at the flag, it doesn't have a star for Guam. It's got a fair amount of Chamorro blood in the red, but these things don't speak for us. They don't represent us, not while we are a non-self-governing territory. And so what the delegation said is that there is the Committee of 24, there's the 4th committee. These are UN bodies in which the people from Guam can speak to the rest of the world, and they can talk about their issues, and that the United States is supposed to respond to them. The United States is supposed to hear them. And so this was an important connection, the first sort of direct connection to that type of activism. And so the UN delegation was on Guam in 1979. And so August 1979, the Constitution was, although some people, especially from Washington, D.C., thought that the Constitution was going to pass for sure, right? And this is what's one of those funny things, is that if you read, and you can read, if you go on WikiLeaks, if you are a patron of Fanachu, you can get access to them. WikiLeaks has a number of diplomatic State Department cables in which you see State Department officials talking about Guam. And really the idea was that because Guam was so patriotic and loving of the United States, this was totally going to pass, because whatever keeps America close and whatever America wants, that's what these people are going to do. And although in one of those reports, it does acknowledge, though, that the old generation thinks like that, but the young generation is forgetting the sacrifice of America to protect the island. And so the young generation, according to one of those cables, is ungrateful compared to their parents and their grandparents towards the United States. And so this vote happens, and it goes down. It is not a successful vote. In fact, there's less than 50% turnout, but it is voted down overwhelmingly. The PDN reported 5-1. I think it's more like 4-1. But it was a huge defeat. And in fact, in some of the cables, you do see that the State Department people had talked to leaders on Guam, or heard from leaders on Guam, who were supportive of the Constitution, but who were worried it wasn't necessarily going to pass. But very few people anticipated that it was going to be that dramatic. Now, on Fanachu in this past year, as part of sort of my efforts to document the history of the island, oral history in particular, I've talked to Hope Cristobal, former Senator Hope Cristobal, former Senator Marilyn Manabusan, who are both part of Parapada, who shared their reflections on defeating the Guam draft constitution. And for those of you, because somebody just messaged asking why the Constitution failed, hopefully you remember what I talked about at the beginning. Genuinely self-governing. What does it mean if you are genuinely self-governing? It means that you have reasonable control over the basic things that a political community and entity needs to exist and to thrive and to improve, right? So do you have control over your constitution? Do you have control over your borders? Do you have control over your economy? And so one of the issues that we face, right, is that do you have control over these things? Is that you can have some control, but do you have a genuine amount of control? And so, for example, I wrote this week in my Pacific Daily News article, I wrote about how when you think about something like the Chinese migrants which have come into the island on boats, right? If you are a state or a territory of the United States, you don't get to control your borders. You don't have your own immigration system. You don't have your own immigration laws. You can't deport people as a state or a territory. But if you are a state, your genuine aspect of self-governance in that, even though it's a federal issue, is that you get to cast votes for president, the president of the United States. You have voting representatives who sit in Congress. You have senators who get to confirm officials in Homeland Security, right? You participate, your representatives participate in the governance and the deciding the sort of the direction of the federal government. So you are part of that. As a territory, you're not part of that. So that's one. And the Constitution failed because when people thought about what a constitution should be, and then they realized that none of the things that I'm worried about can actually be helped with this constitution, they didn't seem to think it was that important, right? So if you were worried, well, you know what, there's too many people coming into Guam nowadays, can we limit that? Not as a territory. As a territory, as a state, you couldn't limit people living in your place, right? You couldn't do that. Can we make sure that we protect Chamorro culture, Chamorro land rights and stuff like that? Not necessarily, not as a territory, because if it conflicts with the Constitution of the United States, or if some judges, courts decide that it does, then no, it's got to go, right? So the Constitution ultimately failed because it couldn't address what people feel or are worried about or concerned about or what they want to see in it. It was more of a shell document meant to kind of reassert control over Guam by the federal government. It wasn't really meant to actually improve the lives of the people here. And so, but Parapada, they were inspired by sort of this UN visiting mission, and they were inspired by sort of the defeat of the Constitution. And so it inspired them then in 1982 to make the first official trip to the United Nations to testify on the issue of Guam. And so from those in the territories, you have a few times every year that you are allowed to testify. There's a conference that is held, a regional seminar. People can be invited to attend that. There's the Committee of 24, which usually meets in the middle of the year. You can go and testify there. The big time when people testify, though, is later in the year, usually in October nowadays, and before the fourth committee. And so the first three Chamorros that traveled to the United Nations were Robert Underwood, who gave the testimony, but he was joined by Chris Perez Howard and also the late Ron Tehan. And so this started a trend. In the 1990s, people continued to travel to the United Nations, especially when the Commonwealth movement was ongoing. That's when you saw senators and governors traveling to the UN to testify about what was happening in Guam and to talk, to add an extra layer of perhaps pressure to the United States as they were trying to negotiate, although unsuccessfully, a Commonwealth status for Guam. So here we have former Senator Hope Cristobal and the late Ron Rivera and the late Ron Tehan again. In 2006, after there wasn't any large delegations that had gone to the United Nations for a few years, this is sort of a delegation that was born primarily from the group Famoxidzen, which was a decolonization group in the US made of diasporic Chamorros and also Chamorros attending college in the States. And so that they were the first group to kind of launch the UN visits for the next generation. And so, whereas those who had gone before were usually connected to the government in some way, those who went in 2006 were community members. So, and you can see here that Julian Uggan, who's on a book tour for No Country for 8-Spot Butterflies in the States. You also you might recognize Victoria Lola Leon Guerrero, who's the head of UOG Press. You might also recognize current Senator Sabina Perez. And so this has continued, and different groups have taken on the role occasionally of organizing delegations to go to the United Nations. So the video that you watched at the beginning, courtesy of Manny Cruz, that is the largest delegation that I've been able to find sort of record of. That is the 2017 delegation, which featured several senators, as well as the governor. Governor Calvo went, and then a significant number of activists, students, scholars, all sorts of people. You saw them all testify in the video at the beginning. And so this continues, sort of this advocacy continues. And so this is not an exhaustive list, but this is the list that I could come up with off the top of my head of those who have traveled to testify at the United Nations. And some of them, some of them you'll recognize, senators, elected leaders, professors. Some of them have gone multiple times. I myself have testified before the fourth committee twice, first in 2007 and then in 2017. I've also gone to the regional seminar, and I've been invited as an expert to testify and at the regional seminar, 6 times. And so, as you can see if you recognize any of the names in here. Your pari might be here, your mali, your primu, your prima, maybe your tsakma lokwi, but that's good. That's good too, even if your tsakma is out there fighting for the people. One of the reasons why this type of advocacy is important is because it creates possibilities for solidarity. So one thing that I always try to emphasize to people is the feeling that, people say, oh, without colonization, we would be primitive, savage, isolated, right? We would be all these things. We'd be disconnected from the world. And colonization connects the colonies, usually to the empire. It also cuts the colonies off from other things, inhibits their ability to connect to others, usually forces them to develop and grow and interact in a way that's beneficial to the colonizer, right? That's why when the Spanish came in, after the Chamorro-Spanish Wars are over, burn the canoes, prohibit navigation, require people to live on Guam or in Rota, don't allow them to travel to other islands as they had before, right? So while Chamorros are being connected to the Spanish Empire and come to see themselves as being connected to the Philippines, because it's the viceroy in the Spanish Empire over there, they become disconnected from the other islands in Micronesia, right? Same thing happens today. And so the advocacy at the UN is important because it creates opportunities for solidarity with other countries, although that is a delicate issue. Sometimes people don't want to get into that, because if you go to the United Nations, you will find that this has happened. People go to the United Nations and they think, oh, you know, I bet France would want to help us. And then, or, oh, the United Kingdom would want to help us, right? Because they're close allies of America. They believe in freedom and liberty and democracy and stuff like that. They won't help you. They're close diplomatic allies of the United States. And they don't want to interfere with America's colonies. So they won't help you. In fact, oftentimes those countries speak against sort of efforts to decolonize I mean, one of the things that has most surprised people is when our Micronesian neighbors have taken stances against Chamorro self-determination and decolonization because of their strong diplomatic relationship with the United States, in which they are expected to support the United States in that international forum. But so that's why if you go to the UN, the countries that are eager to help you are usually the ones that you may not want their help from, because we live in a very American context. So Iran will definitely want to talk to you. China would love to talk to you. Russia would definitely love to talk to you, right? So all of these countries that are not super close to, Venezuela, absolutely. Cuba. And so for whatever reason, they will interact with you. So that's why connecting to countries is often complicated, because the way our ideological assumptions in Guam are very American dominated. So you see those countries as the enemies. We see those countries as the enemies of the United States. And that's why the getting out of that national context, colonial context, into an international context is very difficult. It's very difficult. But aside from that, there are possibilities to connect to other territories and other countries. And so this is from the regional seminar, Committee of 24 regional seminar in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And so you can see from across the world, different people who are tied to different non-self-governing territories, connecting, sharing stories. And so you can see here from the Falkland Islands, American Samoa, US Virgin Islands, Western Samoa, he unfortunately has passed away, from Puerto Rico, from French Polynesia, Maui Nui, from Gibraltar, from Kanaki, New Caledonia, from US Virgin Islands, from the Falkland Islands or the Malvinas. He has also since passed away. And then Amanda Bloss here was the Commission on Decolonization executive director at that time. And then I had been invited as an expert to testify on the situation in Guam. And so these are connections that we may think about, but they're hard to maintain, they're hard to forge, because how often do we here in Guam hear news about American Samoa? In fact, if you're watching or listening to Fanachu, the last time that you probably heard a lot about American Samoa probably came from a Fanachu episode. When do you hear about Puerto Rico if it's not about Jennifer Lopez or a baseball player or a hurricane? How often does our media here or the national media connect us to them, even though we have very similar statuses and we have very similar histories, right? And so these connections of solidarity are hard to forge and they're difficult to maintain. But the United Nations and advocacy there is one way of trying to maintain them. And hopefully you can build from there. And so what I want to end with, though, is the issue of a visiting mission. So one thing that the previous administration, the Calvo administration, and now the Leon Guerrero administration, one thing that they have both been consistent on is asking the United States to approve a visiting mission to Guam. And so this doesn't mean the whole UN comes, but a delegation representing some UN bodies at a minimum 3 countries that are on the Committee of 24 to travel to Guam to, like they did in 1979, to interview people, to hold a meeting in which they can hear from the public, to collect data, to see what is happening. And so Calvo had asked for it when he had testified at the United Nations in 2017. I've written about it quite a bit, sort of the importance of something like this. Leon Guerrero has not testified at the United Nations, but Segundo Magolahi, Josh Norio, the lieutenant governor, has. And so let's actually just watch from 2019, pre-pandemic, PNC News on sort of one of the times that Josh Norio traveled to the UN.
Lieutenant Governor Joshua Tenorio reiterated Guam's quest for decolonization and self-determination during an address before members of the United Nations Special Committee on Decolonization. During his address, Tenorio encouraged the UN Special Committee on Decolonization and other UN member states to continue to pressure on the administering power to decolonize Guam. He also asked the UN to enable a visiting mission to examine and record the situation on Guam. Tenorio said, quote, "This would elevate the issue of decolonization to the highest levels of the administering power," end quote. The last visiting mission to Guam in 1977 brought tremendous attention to the issue of Guam status and preceded a series of referendums and plebiscites used to determine a course of action. That resulted in the drafting and approval of the Guam Commonwealth Act by Guam voters in 1987, its introduction in the United States Congress, and a decade of talks and engagement with the administering power.
All right. Sidus Mase. So I hope that you have found this enlightening. I love to talk about this sort of stuff. I love to provide insight into this history because, you know, for the most part, people in Guam are used to sort of the American way, have become accustomed to the American way. But it's always important to sort of remember that if you are not a full part of America, then what is the value of your comfort? If you are not a real part of America, what is the point of your patriotism? If you believe sort of in the American way, if you believe that that is the best way for Guam, become a full part of the United States, right? If you want something different, then push for greater sovereignty, greater ability to determine our destiny. And, you know, that's why these are things that we have to take seriously. It's very, very easy to kind of imagine that these are not important. That only people with big beards who make podcasts and have big sanahis, only they care about these sorts of things. But the problem with that is that whether you care about it or not, these issues of political status affect everybody on this island. And I always love to quote Robert Underwood, who has testified at the United Nations, former non-voting delegate to the US Congress from Guam. He always reminds us that if you live in Guam and you cannot acknowledge the importance of talking about colonization or the importance of talking about decolonization, it is similar to working in a hospital and refusing to talk about illness or medicine. It's the same thing for us. And so that's why, rather than sort of simply accepting this idea that our role in Guam is to be whatever America wants us, because even then, even that is problematic, should be obvious. But sort of wanting something more from this relationship, wanting to get to a different political status. Thank you so much for watching and listening to this impromptu, spontaneous episode of Fanachu. Again, my guest for today, Edward Alvarez, apologizes for not being able to be here, but I thought it appropriate to cover this sort of history because Ed was one of the people who helped restart UN engagement during the previous governor. And so, Sidus Masi, Nuhamzu Todos, Adios,